Join me as I dive into some of the scariest true hiking horror stories, which will give you chills tonight. One of the biggest misconceptions about nature is that it's always beautiful and safe. We often hear stories about hikers who venture into the wilderness and return with tales of breathtaking scenery and feelings of accomplishment. But what about the stories that don't end so well? What about the hikers who venture into the woods and never come back? Today, I'll share 3 true hiking horror stories that will make you think twice before leaving the trail behind. When you're hiking, so many things can go wrong. You could get lost, injured, or encounter wildlife that's not exactly friendly. And sometimes, despite our best preparations and precautions, things can still take a turn for the worse. Disappearances in national parks happen more often than you'd think, and it's not just because people get lost. Sometimes they vanish into thin air, leaving behind no trace or clue as to what happened to them. And then there are the stories of mysterious creatures lurking in the woods, watching and waiting for their next victim. The unknown is what makes these stories so terrifying. It's the idea that we're not always in control and that nature can be unforgiving and cruel. And when you're out in the middle of nowhere with no phone signal, no help in sight, and no way to defend yourself, it's easy to see how fear can take over. With all these dangers lurking in the shadows, it's no wonder that hiking horror stories are so popular. We're drawn to the thrill of adventure, but we're also drawn to the fear of the unknown. And when you combine the two, you get a recipe for some seriously chilling tales. Let me start with the story of Rachel and her friends, who went on a hike in the Rocky Mountains. They were all experienced hikers, confident in their ability to tackle any challenge, but as they climbed higher, the terrain became treacherous, the rocky paths crumbling beneath their boots. The air grew colder, carrying with it an eerie silence broken only by the whisper of the wind threading through the trees. As night began to descend, the forest thickened around them, the once vibrant green now a suffocating shadow. Every direction seemed the same, a labyrinth of gnarled trees, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers. With no clear path in sight and the oppressive darkness swallowing their surroundings, they stumbled upon an old, weathered cabin hidden deep in the woods. The structure leaned at an unnatural angle, its walls blackened by time and decay as if it had been abandoned for decades. The windows were shattered, and the door hung ajar, creaking with every gust of wind. Desperation overrode their unease, and they decided to take shelter there for the night. But as they stepped inside, the air turned heavy and stifling, thick with the scent of mildew and something far more acrid, something metallic, like blood. The dim light from their flashlights danced across the warped wooden floor, illuminating strange symbols carved into the walls, symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when looked at directly. The shadows seemed to move on their own, pooling in corners and crawling across the ceiling. Then came the sounds. Faint at first, a distant whisper, a creak from the floorboards that didn't match their movements. The wind outside grew louder, howling like a mournful wail, but it wasn't the wind. It was something else, something alive. As the night wore on, the whispers grew louder, and the cabin felt less like a refuge and more like a trap. They weren't alone. Something was watching them, waiting just beyond the thin walls, its presence pressing in from every side. The realization settled in their chests like a stone. The cabin wasn't abandoned. It had been waiting for them. Rachel and her friends huddled together in the center of the cabin, their flashlights trembling in their hands. The whispers became more distinct, forming disjointed syllables, a language none of them recognized yet somehow understood on a primal level. "Leave," it seemed to hiss. "Stay." The conflicting commands were a maddening echo, overlapping and growing louder as if coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then came the knocking. It was slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud, as though whatever was outside wanted them to know it was there. The front door rattled violently on its hinges, and Rachel's heart leaped into her throat. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice cracking, but the only response was a low, guttural growl, deep enough to make the walls quiver. Suddenly, the air inside the cabin turned icy, their breath now visible in the faint beams of their flashlights. The temperature drop was instant and unnatural, sending sharp chills down their spines. One of the friends, Michael, tried to laugh nervously, dismissing it as a draft, but his voice was cut off mid-sentence. His flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into near-total darkness. A soft, shuffling noise came from the corner where he stood, followed by a wet, choking sound. "Michael," Rachel called out, her voice trembling. She swung her flashlight toward him, but he wasn't there. All that remained was his backpack, crumpled on the floor, and a trail of dark, sticky liquid leading to the back of the room. Panic set in, their breaths shallow and quick. "We have to get out of here," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. But the cabin had other plans. The door slammed shut on its own, the force shaking the entire structure. The windows, though shattered, were now covered in thick, pulsating darkness like a living shadow had seeped in to block their escape. The whispers grew deafening, blending into anguished screams and maniacal laughter. Objects around the room began to move, chairs scraping across the floor, old picture frames falling from the walls, their glass shattering on impact. Then they saw it. A tall and gaunt shape emerged from the shadows, its body twisted in unnatural angles, as though it had been broken and pieced back together. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, pinpoints of malevolent light piercing through the room. It didn't walk toward them but glided, its presence suffocating, its gaze boring into each of them as if peering straight into their souls. Rachel's instincts screamed to run, but her legs felt rooted to the floor. The creature extended a long, clawed hand, its fingers curling with an almost delicate grace. As it reached for her, she finally found her voice and screamed, a sound of pure terror that echoed endlessly in the oppressive night. The last thing she saw before her flashlight blinked out was the creature's mouth, a gaping void of jagged teeth that stretched impossibly wide as if it could devour the very light itself. Then the darkness swallowed them whole, leaving the cabin silent once more, waiting patiently for its next visitors. The next story I want to share is about a solo hiker named Alex, a seasoned outdoorsman who decided to venture onto the Appalachian Trail alone. The forest greeted him with its usual charm, towering trees swaying gently in the breeze, the earthy scent of moss and soil, and the soothing rustle of unseen wildlife. But as Alex delved deeper into the trail, the atmosphere began to shift. The air grew heavier. The sunlight dimmed beneath a canopy of unnaturally dense foliage, and the usual chorus of birdsong and insect chatter faded into an unsettling silence. As Alex walked, he began to notice strange markings on the trees, crudely carved symbols that looked like handprints, their edges jagged and uneven as though etched with desperate, trembling fingers. At first, he dismissed them as harmless graffiti, perhaps the work of bored hikers. But the markings became more frequent and grotesque, the shapes contorting into unnatural forms, their crude lines resembling clawed hands or gaping mouths frozen mid-scream. Some bore deep grooves that gouged into the bark as if carved with something far sharper than a knife. Unease started to creep over Alex, a sensation as subtle as the shift in the wind but impossible to ignore. He quickened his pace, yet the carvings seemed to multiply around him, their sinister designs more intricate and deliberate. It felt as though they were guiding him, or worse, trapping him. He told himself it was paranoia, but his gut churned with a primal sense of danger. That's when he began to sense it, the faint, almost imperceptible sound of footsteps behind him, just out of sync with his own. He stopped abruptly and turned, scanning the trail behind him. Nothing. Just an endless tunnel of trees, their shadows stretching like skeletal arms across the path. The forest was utterly still. Too still. His heart thudded in his chest as he resumed walking, forcing himself to ignore the prickling sensation crawling up his spine. Minutes later, the feeling intensified. The footsteps returned, closer this time, accompanied by an occasional crack of a branch or rustle of leaves, sounds that shouldn't have existed in such an otherwise lifeless forest. Alex spun around again, his voice breaking the silence as he called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" His words echoed back at him, distorted and wrong, as if the forest itself were mocking him. Then he saw it. At the edge of his vision, a shape flitted between the trees, too quick to fully register but unmistakably there. It moved unnaturally, its form indistinct yet undeniably human-like, though its limbs seemed too long and its movements too fluid, like water flowing against gravity. Alex's breath quickened as he fumbled for his phone, but the device had no signal, and its battery was draining inexplicably fast. He cursed under his breath and shoved it back into his pocket, his instincts screaming at him to keep moving. The symbols on the trees began to change. They no longer resembled handprints but faces. Faces twisted in agony, their eyes hollow and mouths open in silent screams. The path ahead seemed to stretch impossibly far, the trees bending inward to form a claustrophobic tunnel. And then he heard it. A low, guttural sound, a mix between a growl and a laugh, echoing through the forest. It was followed by a whisper, soft yet piercing, his name drawn out in a voice that wasn't his own. "Alex!" He broke into a run, his boots pounding against the uneven ground, branches clawing at his clothes and face as he barreled forward. The forest seemed alive now, its shadows writhing and shifting, shapes forming in the periphery of his vision only to dissolve when he turned to look. The footsteps behind him grew louder, faster, as though whoever, or whatever, was chasing him was no longer trying to hide. The whispers grew into a cacophony, overlapping voices that surrounded him, speaking in a language he couldn't understand but filled with malice. He tripped on an exposed root, crashing to the ground, his palms scraping against the dirt. When he looked up, he froze. Standing before him, blocking the trail, was a figure cloaked in darkness. Its face was featureless, a blank void that seemed to absorb the light around it. Yet he could feel its gaze, a weight pressing down on him, freezing him in place. It raised one impossibly long arm, pointing to the markings on the nearest tree. As Alex's eyes followed, he realized the newest carving was of him, his face twisted in terror, etched into the bark as though it had been waiting for him all along. The third story is about a group of friends who went on a camping trip deep in the heart of the Ozark Mountains. The day had been perfect. Clear skies, warm sun, and a gentle breeze that carried the crisp scent of pine. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched across their campsite, an unsettling chill settled over the forest. The friends gathered around the crackling campfire, their laughter and chatter a feeble attempt to hold back the creeping unease that seemed to seep in with the darkness. It started subtly. Faint sounds from the surrounding woods. A twig snapping here, a rustle of leaves there. At first, they laughed it off, teasing one another about bears or mischievous raccoons. "It's just the forest," one of them said, trying to sound confident, though their eyes darted nervously toward the trees. But as the minutes stretched on, the noises grew more distinct. Slow, deliberate steps crunching through the underbrush, circling the campsite just beyond the firelight's reach. The sound wasn't random or animal-like. It was calculated, almost as if someone, or something, was pacing around them, waiting. The laughter died down, replaced by an uneasy silence as the friends exchanged nervous glances. "Probably just the wind," another suggested, though their voice trembled. But deep down, they all felt it, that primal, gut-wrenching sensation of being watched. The firelight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the surrounding trees, which now seemed to loom closer, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal fingers. Then came the whispers. Soft at first, barely audible over the crackling fire, but unmistakably there. They seemed to drift on the wind, unintelligible yet filled with an undeniable malice. The friends froze, straining to hear, "Did you hear that?" one of them asked, their voice barely above a whisper. Another nodded, their wide eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the fire. The whispers grew louder, layered with faint, distorted laughter that seemed to echo from every direction, yet had no clear source. As the night wore on, the noises intensified. Heavy footsteps now thudded closer, branches snapping loudly as if something massive was moving through the woods. The friends clung to each other, their flashlights darting into the darkness, but the beams seemed swallowed by the inky blackness, revealing nothing. Then, without warning, the fire sputtered, the flames shrinking as if something unseen was sucking the oxygen from the air. The temperature plummeted, and the once comforting warmth of the fire gave way to an icy chill that bit at their skin. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream erupted from the woods, a sound so raw and piercing it froze them in place. It wasn't human, yet it wasn't entirely animal either. It was a twisted, guttural wail that vibrated through their very bones. One of the friends, trembling, shouted, "We need to leave, now!" They scrambled to gather their belongings, but the forest came alive as they moved. The sounds were everywhere. Branches snapping, heavy breathing, the whispers now a chaotic cacophony of voices, each filled with venom. Just as they began to retreat toward the trail, one of the friends gasped and pointed. "Look!" Their flashlight revealed a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, shrouded in darkness. It was tall, unnaturally so, its outline blurred as if it were flickering between worlds. Its eyes glowed faintly, twin pinpricks of crimson light that seemed to bore into their souls. The figure didn't move, but the air around it shimmered, distorting like heat waves on asphalt. Then it stepped forward. Slowly, deliberately, its movements were impossibly smooth, yet jerky, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. Each step it took seemed to amplify the oppressive weight in the air, making it harder to breathe. The friends bolted, their screams echoing through the forest as they tore down the trail, the figure's presence pressing ever closer. The last thing they heard before the campfire extinguished completely was the sound of laughter, low, guttural, and mocking, fading into the night as if the forest itself were taunting them. The friends never returned to that spot. Some say the Ozark Mountains hold ancient, malevolent forces, waiting for those foolish enough to trespass. Whatever they encountered that night, they would never forget the feeling of being hunted, of being completely and utterly at the mercy of the darkness. One of the most unsettling moments in these stories is the feeling of being completely at the mercy of nature. Rachel and her friends were trapped in that cabin, Alex was stalked on the trail, and an unseen force in the woods surrounded the group of friends. It's the realization that no matter how prepared or experienced you are, nature can still catch you off guard and leave you helpless. So, what can we learn from these stories? We can learn to be more cautious, prepared, and aware of our surroundings when we're out in nature. We can learn to appreciate the beauty of the wilderness, but also respect its power. And we can learn to always be mindful of our mortality. If you've got a hiking horror story of your own, share it with me in the comments below. And if you're new here, consider subscribing for more true horror stories and creepy content. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.